Well, good morning. We're going to continue on in Numbers this morning, as is our custom of late. I mentioned to somebody in one of my classes this last week, who's also a pastor, that I was teaching through Numbers in Sunday school, and he looked like he had seen a ghost. He's like, "You still have people in the room?" "Some, yes." So he was impressed. So I just want to congratulate you for making it through 30-something chapters of Numbers and still being here. So apparently it's unusual. But we're going to be in Numbers 32 primarily. You remember that we're talking in Numbers 31 about, so my NASB doesn't know what they're doing when they say stuff like this. The slaughter of Midian and the division of booty. That's what literally the headings are in my Bible. You can tell that it was done a while ago. What they mean is the division of plunder. The slaughter of Midian. So remember that Midian had, through Balaam, they had lured Israel into idolatry, temple prostitution, and so God gave them specific commands to essentially wipe Midian out. That is essentially their cousins, right? They were descended from Abraham's son. Abraham's son, through Abraham, one of Abraham's wives, not the child of promise, right? So it was sort of a cousin situation here, but they were responsible for this idolatry that Israel had engaged in, and not only engaged in, but brought into their own congregation. So you remember that they did. They sent the men of war there into Midian and slaughtered the men of war because they're sexists, right? Chauvinistic pigs. They didn't hold the women accountable for their own actions, right? They went and killed their husbands, their fathers, and their brothers. And ultimately, the women did suffer for it as well, but that was their command, was to wipe out the nation and to wipe out that leadership. So, you remember that they created an exclusion for themselves. Surely God hath not said to kill the hot chicks, right? So initially they brought the women with them, and Moses said, no, he meant the hot chicks too, guys. So he gave them some rules for who they could take into their household and who they couldn't, along with the other chattel, which is where we get the name cattle. Don't be offended, women. But the division of plunder in this age and this time was the division of chattel, what we would call, in real estate, we would distinguish between real property and personal property. Real property is real estate. Everything else is personal property. So that's what these animals, the livestock, and the slaves essentially were. Now remember, the Midianites were not Canaanites. I think somebody asked about this. What did they do? What did they do with all the women that did go into their households? They were eligible to be married into Israel. They were, because they were not Canaanites. They were not ones that were under the absolute annihilation order here. Just as Moses had married a Midianite, remember, himself. His father-in-law was Jethro, who was the high priest of Midian. They were able to intermarry with people outside of the Canaanites at this time, to some degree, right? All right, so they did that. They brought the sacrifice, kind of a tax essentially, that was given to Yahweh, to the tent of meeting, as a memorial for the sons of Israel before Yahweh, last verse of chapter 31. So chapter 32, I'm not real good with my geography when it comes to the ancient world. So I have this map, probably isn't even big enough for you guys to see, but I can see it. So there. This is describing essentially what the tribes were given ultimately. And you can see that, I think you can see Reuben. Yeah, I'll point it out to you. Reuben and Gad here are two large tribes that are going to play heavily into this chapter, verse 32. So let's start reading there. If you have your Bibles open or clicked to or memorized, scroll in your brain to verse 1 of chapter 32 of Numbers. It says, "Now the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad had an exceedingly large number of livestock, So when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, that it was indeed a place suitable for livestock, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben came and spoke to Moses and to Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, Adaroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elalah, Sebam, Nebo, and Beon, the land which the Lord conquered before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. As Gru would say, light bulb, right? They see the land good for livestock. Y'all don't remember the line from Despicable Me? Come on now. All right. The light bulb goes on, right? The light bulb goes on. They go, this land looks pretty good for livestock, and we have livestock. So they're observing. They know what their animals need. They're in a place where they can utilize the land. Reminds me of a speech that John Wayne gives in the movie McClintock. He said that it does pretty well for cattle, but even the federal government is smart enough to know that you can't farm at 6,000 feet above sea level, right? Something like that. Micah's going to correct me. I may have missed a pronoun or a punctuation mark there. Am I okay? Can I continue here, Micah? Okay. I think I got the quote pretty close. Anyway. There's land that is good for some things and not for others, right? You can't actually grow many things at 6,000 feet above sea level, right? And that's not where this is, but I'm just giving you an example. People tell me I can't grow tomatoes in El Paso, and I do it, right? But I'm not a tomato farmer. It's not my livelihood. I don't. We grow things. We're able to amend soil, but I wouldn't want to amend enough for many livestock, right? As a side note, most of the stuff that we consider the regular plants of the desert were deposited there by the Spanish colonial powers that drove millions and millions and millions of ungulates, sheep, goats, and cows across that property. Before any of this was the United States, before any of it was speaking English, before any of it was really populated, they took their animals across, called the ungulate eruption. And so they dragged a bunch of stuff up from Central America in the colons of their animals and deposited them and made it into what we have today. It used to be grassland. And that's kind of what I think they're seeing here, is that this is grassland. There's lots of calories here that are easily accessible. And so they go to Moses, and they say to him, verse 5, they said, if we have found favor, grace, in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession, and do not take us across the Jordan. Easy peasy. We can stop right here. We don't need the rest of the promised land. Just give us this chunk. We'll take it. It's good for us. No big deal, right? Do you have this problem in your life sometimes where you take the first thing that doesn't look objectionable? Sometimes, right? One in the hand versus two in the bush kind of a thing. I tend to do that, and I caution my sons against that in life, that you should not shy away from the best thing simply because you came across something that wasn't objectionable, career-wise, right? Everything worth doing in your life takes years and years and years and lots of suffering, work, and pain in your life. So don't presume that something that looks less painful is going to actually be less painful in the big picture. You got to pay your dues, right? So that's what they're saying. No, we're here. We have animals. This is a good place for animals. We have livestock. Don't take us across the Jordan. Doesn't seem like a big deal, except it is. Moses said to the sons of Gad and to the sons of Reuben, shall your brothers go to war while you yourself sit here? Now, why are you discouraging the sons of Israel from crossing over into the land which the Lord has given them? So Moses sees it in a bigger picture than they do. The last 20-something years that we have been engaged in conflict in the Middle East this time, it pops up with some regularity. And when people say that America is at war, I said, no, the U.S. Army is at war. The American people are at the movies. And that's kind of what they're saying here. You're going to sit here and raise your livestock and bounce your babies on your knee. You're going to have your family reunions. And you're going to send everybody else to fight this battle. And that's not what God has designed for you. So you're going to camp out here. Is that what you're saying? Shall your brothers go to war, and you just stand here? And this has an effect on them. You're discouraging them from going across and taking what is theirs. It's a fairly small proportion. You can see at least the color coding, even if you can't read the label, Reuben and Gad here. There's a lot of land that has to be taken here. And that's not, like Homestead Act in the United States, right? They would just have land runs. You've read about the land runs in Oklahoma, right? They just started them literally on a foot race, and had a foot race. And had them go claim 160 or 320 acres or whatever, because there was no one there. It wasn't populated, at least observably. There's people with swords and chariots and weapons here occupying this land. But you're discouraging them. And God takes that seriously, the sin of discouraging others. This is a conditional promise, right? They have an unconditional promise to the land. Eternally, in the kingdom and in eternity, they have an unconditional right to the land. They possess it today. But any generation's possession of the land is contingent on them holding it, seizing it, living in obedience to Yahweh in the land, right? Especially in this generation, they were supposed to go take it, and they were supposed to kill everybody in it, and they were supposed to hold it. And discouraging people from being obedient to the Lord is something that the Lord takes seriously. That's why we take certain doctrines seriously. To jump way forward to our last sermon series in Thessalonians, it's why we don't permit people to rob others of the blessed hope of the rapture at El Paso Bible Church, because that discourages people who have a promise from God that they're supposed to embrace. It's designed to give us comfort in the midst of difficulty, and we take that seriously, right? And so Moses rightfully understands this. He takes it seriously. We're not going to permit you to discourage the rest of these tribes from going in and taking the land that they have been promised if they will simply take it. So don't discourage them. And Moses has an illustration for them. Verse 8, this is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. Right? Well, then when they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the sons of Israel so that they did not go into the land which Yahweh had given them. So the Lord's anger burned in that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have followed Yahweh fully. He's saying you're doing exactly what the previous generation did when I sent them to spy out the land. You were supposed to go into the land with your eyes open and see how big the enemy is, see how powerful they are, see how many resources they have, how well entrenched they are, see how long they've been established and how well they know the land, and go, God has got this. That's no problem. And that's not what they did. And Moses is drawing a direct parallel to that discouragement of the spies coming back and saying, we are grasshoppers in our own sight in comparison to these guys. They're not even looking at God at that point. You guys are discouraging people because they've already helped you wipe out the people in this part of the land. And we've already taken possession of it, but you're discouraging them. So don't do that, because the Lord's anger burns against people who discourage his children from grasping onto their promises. I say that, I spend a lot of time on it because people sometimes get real upset at me. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. No, you believe in baptismal regeneration, you idiot. You believe in conditional justification, idiot. You're standing in the way of people embracing God's perfect promises and discouraging them, and that's serious, idiot. I don't often call them an idiot. I'm just in a grumpy mood today. But they are idiots. Frankly, those things are important and perfect in Scripture. Don't discourage God's people from seizing the promises and grasping onto them. So, the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until the entire generation of those who had done evil in the sight of Yahweh was destroyed. Now behold, you have risen up in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to add still more to the burning anger of Yahweh against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once more abandon them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people. So that's important. What did he say? Basically, he says, you're going to cause all the rest of them to stumble if you discourage them. It's not simply going to be you and your family and your children and your grandchildren and your tents and your possessions that are going to be destroyed and you don't take possession of the land. If you discourage these people, they will turn away from him. And he will not be with them, and they will not seize that promise because they're not walking faithfully to seize it. And that blood will be on you. For if you turn away from following him, verse 15, he will once more abandon them in the wilderness. You will destroy all these people. Then they came near to him and said, we will build here sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our little ones. But we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the sons of Israel until we have brought them to their place, while our little ones live in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the sons of Israel has possessed his inheritance, for we will not have an inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has fallen to us on this side of the Jordan towards the east. I'm not sure this is what they had in mind before Moses got angry and reminded them of what they were doing. It may have been a change of mind, a change of direction, but it is a good one, right? He said, let's just leave our stuff here. Let's leave our babies here. Let's leave our kids here. That's not a bad thing, right? Right? Not terrible. They don't need to go out to war. Let's build sheepfolds here so we don't have to be herders while we're fighting the battle. And we'll do that. And we'll go to war as long as it takes with the rest of these tribes, with our brothers, until we have possessed the whole thing. So Moses said to them, if you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before Yahweh for the war, and all of you armed men cross over the Jordan before Yahweh until he has driven out his enemies from before him, and the land is subdued before Yahweh, then afterward you shall return and be free of obligation toward Yahweh and toward Israel, and this land shall be yours for a possession before Yahweh. But if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Build yourselves cities for your little ones and sheepfolds for your sheep, and do what you have promised. Has to be unanimous, right? All of the armed men have to go. All of them. One that turns aside is enough to cause a problem, as I read it. Did I miss that? I don't think so. All of you armed men, everybody that was in the census as an army member, soldier, warrior, whatever they were called back then, you all need to go. I grew up in churches where everything was a unanimous decision. Not because they were all so happy and joyful, but because they believed that they needed to wait until everything was unanimous to make a decision. And if it wasn't unanimous, they would sit there and glare at each other until somebody folded. Kind of like jury duty ends up being sometimes, right? Jury decision in certain situations has to be unanimous, right? I think maybe all of them, I'm not sure, but certainly in capital cases, it has to be unanimous. And there, this is the subject of all sorts of plot lines where they try to pressure the person into agreeing with the other members. This was not exceptional in this case because the census was taken of the warriors so that all of them would always go out to war, essentially, or be available. He's not demanding anything of them that wasn't already demanded of them. He said that there are no exceptions, however. You have to take the land. You have to possess it, and all of you have to be on board to do this. It's a security issue if nothing else, right? So, pragmatically, if any of these tribes don't take the land that is theirs, they're at risk, right? They're at risk from being infiltrated and overcome. We have multiple records in Judges of the Midianites arose again, were fighting against Gideon. The Philistines, everybody knows the Philistines, right? Because everybody wants to talk about slaying the giants in their lives. Yeah, the Philistines. Everybody knows Goliath. Those guys were not exterminated. They caused that problem anyway. But Moses, this is an acceptable option. In fact, it's probably a good option. Not to cross all of your animals and all of your kids and everything across the river, since these were fairly large tribes. The sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben spoke to Moses, saying, "Your servants will do just as my Lord commands. Our little ones, our wives, our livestock, and all our cattle shall remain there in the cities of Gilead, while your servants, everyone who is armed for war, will cross over in the presence of Yahweh to battle, just as my Lord," that should be in lowercase, because they're talking about Moses, as Moses said. So Moses gave command concerning them to Eleazar the priest and to Joshua the son of Nun and to the heads of the fathers' households of the tribes of the sons of Israel. Moses said to them, "If the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben, everyone who is armed for battle, will cross with you over the Jordan in the presence of Yahweh, and the land is subdued before you, then you shall give them the land of Gilead for a possession. But if they will not cross over with you armed, they shall have possessions among you in the land of Canaan." You may not understand what they just did. It makes it to where they're no longer sovereign, right? They're still going to have land. Like if they don't go and do this, they're not going to have these fields. They're not going to have the place where all the livestock is going to eat well and all that. Plenty of water. They're going to get planted among the other tribes, and they will essentially have their identity subsumed, at least in those generations. Right? It's important that we understand that it is actually a threat. In our world, your average person here in El Paso thinks that illegal immigration is not a problem. Right? Yes? Your average person, I'm not talking about you and me. We're smarter than that, right? But your average person in El Paso, oh, well, they're just looking for a better life. Well, my response to that is that every criminal is looking for a better life. Right? Anyone who robs you is looking for something they didn't have to work for. They're looking for a benefit that they didn't earn. Now, multiply that by the millions and millions, and I have a heart, folks, right? But one of the problems with that is that a culture gets subsumed by delusion. And in Scripture, that is that's seen as a negative. That's seen as a judgment. If your culture is subsumed. In the ancient Near East, the way they did that was what the Israelites did to Midian. Killed all the men, killed all the hot chicks, enslaved all the younger women and all the kids, took all their stuff. Right? That was the practice. Kill all the men and make babies with their women. That's how it worked. In our culture, we don't have to do that. We have a birth rate that is substantially under replacement in America, generally, except for illegal immigration and certain jihadists. They'll have the same effect. If you have one medieval death cult that has 10 kids per family, and your WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant folks that everybody hates these days, only have 1.2, eventually your culture dies. The birth rate wins. It's inexorable. So that's what the threat is. You will go across. Israel will get the land, and you will not have a possession in it with your name on it. It won't look like this. It won't be the land of Reuben and the land of Gad. And it's a judgment. The sons of Gad, verse 31, and the sons of Reuben answered, saying, as Yahweh has said to your servants, so we will do. We ourselves will cross over armed in the presence of Yahweh into the land of Canaan, and the possession of our inheritance shall remain with us across the Jordan. So Moses gave to them, to the sons of Gad, to the sons of Reuben, and to the half-tribe of Joseph's son Manasseh, the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the kingdom of Og, the king of Bashan. That was the giant guy, right? The land with its cities, with their territories, the cities of the surrounding land. The sons of Gad built Dibon and Adaroth and Aroer and Atroth Shophan and Jazer and Jogbehah and Beth Nimrah and Beth Haran as fortified cities and sheepfolds for sheep. The sons of Reuben built Heshbon and Elealeh and Kiriathaim and Nebo and Baal Meon, their names being changed. If I change a name, I make it easier to say. And Sibmah, they gave other names to the cities which they built. The sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, went to Gilead and took it and dispossessed the Amorites who were in it. So Moses gave Gilead to Machir, the son of Manasseh, and he lived in it. Jair, the son of Manasseh, went and took its towns and called them Havoth Jair. And Nobah went and took Kenath and its villages and called it Nobah after his own name. Nothing like a little narcissism to season the end of the chapter. So they did that. Now, inherent in the command, and this is something we've made a big deal out of, was some basic patriarchal requirement. And that is, say that you are the head of the family, or the head of the tribe, the chief. The Rosh is what they would call it. It sounds like roach, and my wife shivers every time I say the Hebrew word Rosh, because it sounds like roach. She doesn't like roaches. Anyway, so I'm not going to use the Hebrew word. The chiefs of the families, right? So say they go, and they have, these are big tribes, and they find out that one of the people in the census doesn't want to go. What are they supposed to do? Compel? Discipline? Right? Persuade, at least? We have this stupidity in our culture that we're not supposed to tell people what to do. You have an area, you have a context in which you're absolutely required to tell people what to do. That is not my general role as a pastor, generally. If you say to me, what should I do? I can tell you, well, there are these choices. These are ones that are honoring to the Lord. These are the consequences. These are ones that are not honoring to the Lord, and these are those consequences. You can make your choice. There are certain exceptions to that. But when it comes to my family, my tribe, which, for me and my brothers, we're already sort of on the road to nation building, apparently, a lot of us. There is something that I'm supposed to tell them to do and not to do. And that was a responsibility, multi-generational responsibility in these tribes, because the consequences were terrible, right? If one of the people, one of the families decided they didn't want to do this, that it was too much work to build the sheepfolds and watch over the sheep without the oldest sons, and they didn't want to send their sons across the Jordan, what was the consequences? I'm sorry? Well, they don't get the land. Who doesn't get the land? The whole tribe doesn't get the land. All of them. And they get interspersed and diluted and lose their heritage. So, substantial. But it's become kind of an idol in our culture that people make their own decisions and without input, that I'm not going to tell people what to do. I'm not going to tell them who to love. So romantic. The heart wants what it wants. That's a load of malarkey. Cheap chicken bologna, frankly. That funny? Oh, I'm just kidding. They're chuckling back there. It's because I'm being mean. They think it's funny. It ain't funny. I'm being mean. You need to choose to love somebody that holds the same values and the same promises that God has given, that is headed on the same trajectory, that has the same goals in life and understands the roles that exist in a family. Right? That goes all the way down to the very basics. It's a responsibility, and it was a responsibility here. Now, the Lord's protection was offered freely to those who embraced His promises and went into the land. Right? They might have not done it because they were still scared, because they were still grasshoppers in their own sight compared to the Canaanites. The most dangerous place for them to be was to stay on the east side of the Jordan while everybody else went to war. That was the most dangerous place for them to be. And the patriarchs of these families had the responsibility to impress upon them the danger that disobedience held for them. And not necessarily to be nice. All right. There are some parallels, right? We're not Israel. We're not promised land on either side of the Jordan River, right? I want my 75,000 sheep if I'm part of one of these tribes. Can you imagine thinking that the 75,000 sheep was a blessing? You know what sheep smell like? It's awful. Anyway, let's continue. So I'm going to warn you, chapter 33 is not an inventory, but it is a record of their travels. And so when we read this, we need to understand why it's here, I think. Well, at least why I think it's here. It's here for the same reason that the moment that God declared judgment on the older generation of Israel, you will not enter the land, the moment they did that, that older generation's responsibility was consolidated almost entirely to teach them, train them, guide them, the younger generation, and what they would need to know to embrace their inheritance in the land. That was it. They weren't supposed to go seek another home somewhere else. They weren't supposed to try to take Canaan by themselves in their own power without the Lord's help, because again, they were grasshoppers in their sight on their own. They were simply to prepare the next generation to embrace the promises that God had given them. They were not supposed to grasp after the promises that they had lost, because that's foolish. They no longer had them. This chapter exists as a record of God's faithfulness during their journeys for this younger generation that is about to enter the land. So let's just read it. It's going to be a review for us also here. Verse 1 of chapter 33 says this: "These are the journeys of the sons of Israel, by which they came out from the land of Egypt by their armies, under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded their starting place according to their journeys by the command of Yahweh, and these are their journeys according to their starting places. They journeyed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, and on the next day after the Passover, the sons of Israel started out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Now, when you read these things, you ought to remember the events that surrounded them, right? What does it mean that the Israelites went out the next day after the Passover? Boldly in the sight of the Egyptians. What had the Egyptians just experienced? The angel of death, as the final plague that had come upon all of them all those years earlier. God preserving his people and his heritage in the midst of them. And that's what it says, verse 4. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom Yahweh had struck down among them, the Lord had also executed judgment on their gods. We've talked about that, but ancient Near Eastern people saw the conflict that they engaged in on the earth as evidence of essentially deity warfare. The gods of the peoples were fighting against each other. And when the people on earth won, then their God won, right? And so when Israel walks out of Egypt scot-free with all of their firstborn alive, and Egypt is burying their dead, Yahweh has judged their gods. Then the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses and camped in Sukkot. They journeyed from Sukkot and camped in Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. They journeyed from Etham and turned back to Pi-hahiroth. I don't usually get tongue-tied here, sorry. Which faces Baal-Zephon, and they camped before Migdal. They journeyed from before Hahiroth and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness. And they went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham and camped at Marah. What happened at Marah? Why was it named Marah? Bitter water, right? Conflict over that. Remember that God provided water for them. And they camped in the wilderness of Sin. It may be Sin, but I don't want to say that. They journeyed from the wilderness of Sin and camped at Dophkah. They journeyed from Dophkah and camped at Alush. They journeyed from Alush and camped at Rephidim. Now it was there that the people had no water to drink. Again, this was a repetitive thing. They journeyed from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. They journeyed from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibroth Hattavah. They journeyed from Kibroth Hattavah and camped at Hazeroth. They journeyed from Hazeroth and camped at Rithmah. They journeyed from Rithmah and camped at Ramon Perez. They journeyed from Ramon Perez and camped at Libnah. They journeyed from Libnah and camped at Rissah. They journeyed from Rissah and camped at Kehelathah. They journeyed from Kehelathah and camped at Mount Shepher. They journeyed from Mount Shepher and camped at Haradah. They journeyed from Haradah and camped at Makaloth. They journeyed from Makaloth and camped at Tehath. They journeyed from Tehath and camped at Terah. They journeyed from Terah and camped at Mithkah. It's a lot of camping. And they journeyed from Mithkah and camped at Hashmonah. They journeyed from Hashmonah and camped at Moseroth. They journeyed from Moseroth and camped at Bnei Jakan. They journeyed from Bnei Jakan and camped at Hor Haggidgad. They journeyed from Hor Haggidgad and camped at Jotbathah. They journeyed from Jotbathah and camped at Abronah. They journeyed from Abronah and camped at Ezion-Geber. They journeyed from Ezion-Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They journeyed from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor at the edge of the land of Edom. Then Aaron the priest went up to Mount Hor at the command of Yahweh and died there in the 40th year after the sons of Israel had come from the land of Egypt on the first day in the 5th month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. Now the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev in the land of Canaan, heard of the coming of the sons of Israel. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor and camped at Zalmonah. They journeyed from Zalmonah and camped at Punon. They journeyed from Punon and camped at Oboth. They journeyed from Oboth and camped at Iye-Abarim at the border of Moab. They journeyed from Iyim and camped at Dibon-Gad. They journeyed from Dibon-Gad and camped at Almon-Diblathaim. They journeyed from Almon Diblathaim and camped in the mountains of Abarim before Nebo. And they journeyed from the mountains of Abarim and camped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho. And they camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth as far as Abel Shittim in the plains of Moab. It's a lot of hard names, guys. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot, according to your families. The larger you shall give more inheritance, and to the smaller you shall give less inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to anyone, that shall be his. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides. And they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you." It's a record of memories. Once a year, I drive to a conference down in Houston. And it's a long drive to do by myself. But I never give a second thought as to whether I'm going to get there anymore. Do y'all think about that? You should. Actually, you should, right? If you're going to go across that much desert on a vehicle with that many moving parts, you at least better have water and a firearm, right? You should think about things like that. But you're not preoccupied with that. But for most of the history of humanity, we have about 2 minutes. Journeying itself, just being on a journey, was dangerous. How many times has Israel been attacked just in the record of their journeys? And this record here is important and significant here because it was the memory of God's preservation and the keeping of all of his promises, even though they were not dwelling in a permanent place. They were not living in stone houses and fortified cities. They were out and living in tents, wandering around in the desert. And they were provided security and promises and provision there. Right? So all of these things were meant to be a permanent part of the historical record of this nation. They were not supposed to forget it. And then God promises to them, and I want to make this point real quick because people laugh at me sometimes when I get to the New Testament. Right? And Paul talks about a thorn in his side. Yeah? You remember where he said that I asked the Lord to deliver me from this thorn in my flesh 3 times, and God's answer was, "My grace is sufficient for you," right? And I am being slightly humorous. I said every pastor I know knows exactly what the thorn in the side is. It's a church member. It's a person. It's definitely a person. I joke about that slightly, but this is where I get that, by the way. If you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as ice picks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, right? It's a figurative reference. Although it may become, you may get a spear in your side from these people, but it's a figurative reference to the way people behave towards each other. So if I say that to you, we can chuckle for a second, but then get serious, all right? Because the thorn in the flesh is frequently a human, and it starts out way back here in Numbers. All right, so we started 2 minutes late, so we get another minute or so for questions. Anybody have any? Sorry, I should have waited. Y'all never have any questions, so I closed my computer. Comments? Yeah, Scott.
So you went through the record of the journey after they left.
Yes.
Well, this is during that 40 years after they initially refused to go into Canaan?
No, this is all of the journeys. Remember, it starts in Egypt. So Moses is going through, this is how your fathers were brought through, and this is how you were brought through, how the continuity of the journey was. Yeah. So it wasn't just the one generation that was now here, because that started on the ridge overlooking Canaan, right? But this one starts in Egypt at the first Passover. Yeah, so he actually does connect that. He says you need to look at the whole continuity of what I've done for you as a people from the beginning on your birthday, the day we came out of Egypt. Yeah. And understand that it includes discipline. Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, you remember, yeah, in other places, the way that, okay, so she's asking, was the land inhabitable? It was inhabited already. So, yes, yeah, it wasn't totally raw land. And so, but there were situations, right? So what happens, it wasn't in this story, but what happens when they go to Jericho? The walls come crumbling down, right? So you got some, if you're going to inhabit that city, you're going to have to rebuild something, right? Although they fell outward, which means probably all the houses were all still intact, except for the ones that were in the wall, you know. But the part of the promise was that you will live in houses you did not build. You will harvest from vineyards and fields you did not plant. I mean, that's actually in Deuteronomy, which is chronologically after this, right? The very last days, the second giving of the law to this generation. We'll get there. But that was the promise. So yeah, it was habitable. And if you've ever taken a piece of property from having nothing on it to living on it, you know that's a major, 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 major benefit. Especially if you bang all the nails yourself and install all the pipes and run all the wires. A lot of work. Not that they had electricity, you know, but y'all know what I mean. Going from nothing to habitability is very difficult. Any other questions? Y'all just want donuts now. Yeah, that's all right. Me too. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the historical record, the permanent establishment of the record of your faithfulness to 2 generations of Israel that were in the wilderness, that you brought out of Egypt and are, at this point in the record, poised to bring into the land and seize it. And Father, we thank you for that, because it tells us so much about how you keep your promises and how valuable it is that we remember how you keep your promises. We love you and we thank you for it. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.